Hey there, everybody. Welcome to our Module 2 video lecture. Now, in our first video, we talked about economics as a study of choice. So in this module, we are going to just dig into that concept a little bit more and look at some base theory trade-offs and think a little bit about what it means to make choices rationally. Let's get started. So in our previous video, we talked about how at every level in our society, individuals, firms, whole countries, right, choices have to be made about how to use scarce resources. And we talked about our factors of production, land, our raw materials and components that go into products and services, labor, the people who actually make our products and services and transform inputs into finished goods and services. Economic capital, the technology and equipment that we use and the processes that we use to make that transformation possible, and the entrepreneurial ability of the inventor, of the owner, of the person who takes the risk and responsibility to have that idea and see it all the way through and run those businesses and accept the consequences of those choices. We also talked about how our resources might be constrained, whether it's one of those factors of production, right? We only have so much raw material, so many workers, so much ability and comfort, or our money to buy economic capital or hire labor or get raw materials, or our time to see a project or an idea through. We have constraints. And when we have constraints, that means we have to make choices about how to use those constrained resources. So before you go to the next slide, I want you to think about your constrained resources right now. Let's pop a little micro in here and list those in your notes. Then let's see how we talk about constraint in these broad economic contexts. We're going to start our understanding of choice and decision by looking at monetary constraints, right? A lack of funds is the most basic type of constrained resource because it isn't a factor of production itself, but it's used to get all of those other factors of production that we need in order to create goods and services. So we're going to talk about a constrained budget when our money is limited. Now this serves at both macro and micro levels. And so a budget constraint or a budget constraint line, if we're talking about the graph that we see here, represents all of the combinations of goods that somebody can afford given the prices of those goods and the resources that they have to spend. So I want you to think about your basic trip to the grocery store in this context, right? Because when you go to the grocery store, you have your grocery store budget, what you can afford to spend, and you have to decide the quantities of grocery you're going to purchase, given the prices of those products and the amount that you have to spend. In a macro sense, same idea. A government has a budget. They have a set idea about the priorities they want to spend on, and they have to choose how they're going to maximize the use of their budget. Here, we're going to be using through our chapter an example, a really simple one with Charlie. Charlie has a budget of $10 and he only has 2 products to choose from. We're going to make this model as simple as possible. He'll be able to buy burgers or he'll be able to buy bus tickets with his budget. So what we have is a budget constraint of $10 and some combinations of burgers and bus tickets he'll be able to get. When you or a government or Charlie makes a choice, he is giving something up in making that choice, right? When we choose, other options get put away. We call those other alternatives the opportunity cost of our choice. So when Charlie makes a choice, let's say he chooses point A, he is giving up his second best option, whatever point on the line that was. So as we think about the choices we make, we also want to consider what's being given up when our choices are selected. What we won't consider, interestingly enough, though, are costs incurred in the past. Choices that we've made previously, which are basically unrecoverable. So this, in our graph, for example, is Charlie's current budget. If he previously had a budget for burgers and bus tickets, that is a sunk cost. He's already spent it. It doesn't matter what he's previously spent on burgers and bus tickets, and we're not going to be thinking about that sunk cost for Charlie. So as we process an economic decision, we look at the constraint, we look at our options. When we make a choice, we consider what is being given up, and we examine that opportunity cost, but we exclude from our consideration past sunk costs that cannot be recovered. Now, I've promised you all a little bit of math and graphing and analysis, and here we go. Budget constraints can be shown in 3 different ways. And we want to be able to move through those 3 different ways pretty seamlessly. And our practice activities will work through the actual math. So for this example, let's just look at the information the way that it's presented so that we get comfortable with each of those methods for showing a budget constraint. The first way we can show it is through an equation. And in this case, the equation shows that our budget constraint line or budget constraint equation will be a function of the price times the quantity of each product that we are considering. And we can have as many items, price and quantity for each one, as are available to us to choose from. So your budget equation when you go to the grocery store, for example, has your budget amount for your trip and the prices and quantities of each product on your shopping list or that you're considering buying. For Charlie, his budget constraint is a limit of $10, and he'll have some combination of burgers, some quantity of burgers that cost $2 each, plus some quantity of bus tickets that cost 50 cents each. And the easiest way, if you're not using calculus, to figure out what combinations we have that use our budget is to just make a list. And the way that I like to make this list is to start at the ends of my budget constraint. I want to know in my sample what my max options are. So let's start here with point A. And here are the other two ways I can show this information. I can show it in a table, also called a budget constraint schedule, and a graph. So at point A, Charlie could choose to spend all of his money on burgers. Nothing else. No bus tickets. Super hungry. Just wants to eat burgers. No bus tickets needed. For $10, he can get 5 burgers. 5 times 2 and have no money left over. At the other end of the spectrum, maybe he's completely full. Maybe he doesn't eat burgers. Charlie could choose to get 20 bus tickets for 50 cents each, and that would also fully spend his $10. So we've got the ends of our budget constraint line if we buy all of one product and nothing of the other. Then each point in the middle on that line represents a combination of burgers and bus tickets that could be purchased for exactly $10, maximizing the use of Charlie's budget. So let's say we were down where we left off at point F, but Charlie says, you know, I kind of do want a burger. I'm hungry. So if he gets 1 burger, he's going to spend $2 on that burger. That gives him $8 left of his budget to spend on bus tickets. At 50 cents each, he could buy 16 bus tickets. If he's got another friend and his goal is to have 2 burgers, well, 2 times 2 is $4 spent on burgers. That leaves $6 of his budget left to spend on bus tickets. He could only get 12 bus tickets for his remaining $6, but still maximized full $10 used. And we could do the same at point C. If he wants 3 burgers, $6 on the burgers, $4 on the bus tickets. And point B, $8 spent on burgers for 4 of them, and 4 bus tickets with the remaining $2. Connect the dots, we have our budget constraint line. All of these are maximizing the budget, using everything Charlie has available to him. If, however, Charlie chooses to be at some point beneath the line, some combination that leaves our person with some money left over, he's underutilizing his budget. Right? Maybe he wants to save some of that for later, but he's not fully maximizing his budget constraint if he picks, let's say, for example, 3 burgers, that would cost him $6. 2 bus tickets would cost him $1, so he'd have some money left over. Right? He's underutilizing resources. Above the line, up here in kind of this white space, are all of the choices that Charlie can't have with the resources he has. They are unattainable because he doesn't have enough resources in his budget. So for example, if he wanted 10 burgers, that would cost him $20. It exceeds his budget. So the only way to get to these unattainable spaces is to get more resources. And we know and we experience these items in practice, but this lets us see what we know and what we've practiced in the real world in a very clear quantitative way. As we expand our concept of the budget constraint into the macro context, we see a slight adjustment. Most of the time, it's not going to be a straight line. And instead of just calling it a budget constraint, we recognize what we call the production possibilities frontier or the production possibilities curve. And what we have in our text example shows a government making trade-offs between two big items that a society often wants: healthcare and education. So just like our budget constraint on the previous slide, we would begin by identifying, for whatever budget we have available, what our point would be if we spent it all on healthcare. Then we would identify what it would be if we spent all of the budget on education. Now, the reality is most societies wouldn't be very happy with those. They would want some combination in the middle, some healthcare and some education. Where on that curve they fall will really depend on the society itself, right? But the same idea of resource utilization absolutely applies here. Any point on the curve will utilize the whole budget that the government has available. Any point under the curve means that there are resources not being utilized at all, and we have underutilization of our budget. And some point above the curve out here in space means that we have unattainable combinations that we could not reach for the society unless we have more resources. So if all that is the same, why is this curve curvy? The reason it curves is because when we have different sizes of industry, we have different productive capacities of the companies and the people that make up our government, some combinations might be more easily attained with less opportunity cost than others. And that's what we see when we bow out here. So for example, at point B, right, if I was at point A and I want a little bit of education, right at the very beginning, I moved to point B, I can get a huge jump in education without having to give up too much of my healthcare options, right? So I can see a big gain in education for very little opportunity cost. As I move to point C, though, my gain in education is still big, but I have to give up a little bit more. The opportunity cost gets a little bit greater. And if I wanted to go from point C to point D, wow, look at the amount of healthcare that I'd have to give up to get to that extra level, right? And we could do the same if we went backwards, right? From F to D, I don't have to give up very much education to get healthcare, but boy, from D to C, that's a big jump in the loss of education to get more healthcare, and even more as we go. Okay. So different levels of opportunity cost, different productive capacities, and ideally, right, somewhere out in this bode area is the most amount of both items that we'd be able to get if we were interested in a balance of the two items that we are considering in our economy. So as we migrate through our chapters, we're going to be looking at those trade-offs pretty closely to see if we can identify where and how we should choose in order to maximize the items for our society. So now we have defined sort of the basic constraints of choosing. We did that with a linear view of a budget constraint, and we did it with the production possibilities frontier so that we can see a macro maximization of our choices. But now we want to dig into some assumptions, because in order to get these curves to work and reflect our society in a useful and meaningful way, we need to be thinking like an economist and making some choices about how we structure the environment so that we can really say with confidence and with certainty that items are actually related, that choices are good or bad, optimal or not optimal, and that the trade-offs that we think we're making are actually sound. So let's check out those rational assumptions. Economics is built on an assumption of rationality and the theory of self-interest. So now this is a really simplified view of how humans make decisions. It comes out of our Greek and European traditions. And what the assumption of rationality says is that people will make choices that are in their own best self-interest, and that humans are able to know and deduce what's in their best interest. This does not mean that we're saying that people are going to make decisions greedily or selfishly, but that in their assessment of their world, there's some sort of desirable benefit gained from making a choice. So let's look at some examples. For an individual, choices like, should I work, go to school, or try to do both? What skills should I learn or grow? What knowledge should I have? Is it better to sleep, study, or go out with my friends? Right? They all have the ability, a rational choice filters through the lens of what would be in my best interest today, right now, and in my future. And we weigh those pros and cons when we make those individual choices. Businesses would do the same in a rational way, right? Should we hire additional staff for the summer? Is it better to buy inventory now, or do we wait till later? What should be our production quantities next year? Governments choosing whether to spend money on healthcare or education, what policies to grow, what policies to restrict, all examples that economists are going to assume they've carefully considered, that they've weighed the pros and cons and are making choices in the best interest of their own well-being and the well-being of their populations. A second assumption we're going to make relates to the existence of the law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns says that as we add additional resources to a purpose, the gain that we're going to get, the marginal benefit from adding those additional increments, will decline. So, for example, if you study economics for an hour, you're likely to get some benefit from that review. If you keep studying without a break for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, each hour extra that you spend is likely to get you less benefit with no other changes, right? If you're not taking brain breaks, if you're just trying to power through, you're going to retain less and less, right? So that would be a law of diminishing return. You're getting less for putting in the same amount of effort. Similarly, improvements in performance and productivity of a business or of a nation will sooner or later flatline, right? We'll stop seeing gains if we just keep putting resources into the same process without innovation, without change, right? We're going to get less and less noticeable benefit. We might stay flat or we'll go down eventually, right? So we expect to see over time that resources become less effective when we just keep accumulating them without accompanying growth and innovation. And that law of diminishing return is what we saw in our healthcare trade-off, right? As we moved along the curve, we kept pumping more and more into gaining education, losing more and more in our healthcare in that trade-off. So there is a yin and yang to that marginal push for resources and the bigger and bigger opportunity cost that we see. And it is up to us, and economists assume that our goal would be to balance efficiency and effectiveness, right? We want to have both. We want to be effective, have the right combinations to get the job done, but we want to do that efficiently with as little to no waste as possible. So productive efficiency means that we have maximized the use of all of our resource inputs, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability, and that we would not be able to be more effective, more efficient without more resources. So on the curve, when we are operating using all of our budget, we are productively efficient. Below the curve, we are productively inefficient because we're not maximizing the use of all of our resources. But we also want to be allocatively efficient. And that is, we don't just want any combination of goods and services, we want the right goods and services. We want the combination that our society cares about. So we're going to spend time not just using all of our resources, but using them wisely. And economists assume that we are wanting to be efficient and effective by being allocatively efficient and then utilizing those resources to maximize the good for the society at large. So let's take that concept, allocative and productive efficiency, and introduce a vocab word called comparative advantage. This will pop up especially in our trade and policy chapters. And comparative advantage is what products or goods, services countries can produce with the least amount of opportunity cost. In other words, when are they most productively efficient? So here we can see two countries, Brazil and the US. Both countries produce sugar cane, and wheat, but they have different combinations of being productively efficient and allocatively efficient. Okay. Brazil is much better. Climate's better, conditions are better for producing sugar. They have lower opportunity costs. They give up less wheat in order to make sugar. If they had a limited resource, it'd be easier to give up the wheat than it would be to give up the sugar. And by producing sugar, they can get a lot more production. And so we see a pretty tall curve that absolutely favors sugar, right? Way more on the vertical axis than the horizontal. The US, we're the opposite, right? Our conditions way more conducive to producing wheat. I can get big gains as I move on the curve in wheat production by giving up very little sugar. It's not a great product for me. So we're way more productively efficient at wheat. This is where macro specialization in trade would come in. If Brazil focuses on sugar because they have the lowest opportunity cost or the highest comparative advantage, and the US specializes in wheat, and then we trade, the world benefits from having more of both goods, and each country benefits because it is maximizing the efficiency of their resources. So pretty cool how these items all start to come together even in these early chapters about choice. So now let's finish off chapter 2 by talking about some vocabulary for terms you already know. Sometimes disciplines have really specific terminology, and one of those terms that's really common in economics is the concept of marginal analysis. Now, making a decision at the margin means when you're looking at your choices for a little bit more or a little bit less of something. And often you'll hear it described as what would happen if I have just one more unit of a good or a service. So, for example, marginal analysis in action. What is the additional gain in calories lost if I work just one extra hour of exercise into my schedule each week? Right? So what's my little extra calorie loss from a little extra exercise? How much additional revenue can be gained if our store stays open an extra hour on Sundays? One more hour of time at the margin? How much extra revenue? Decision at the margin. And how much trade would we lose if steel tariffs increase by an extra 5%? Right? Weighing the costs and benefits. Now, you've probably weighed the costs and benefits both quantitatively and qualitatively in your own life. And now you can tell people, I'm just performing a marginal analysis, weighing the marginal cost of a choice versus the marginal benefit from that choice. When you make those choices, when you're weighing your information, you can also talk about weighing the value of positive statements versus normative statements. A positive statement is something that is objectively testable. Conclusions in positive statements are based on logic and evidence, and we can try them out to see if they hold true. So they're objective in the sense that they are testable. So hypotheses are testable positive statements, and facts are testable positive statements. So, for example, the statement, "It is raining outside right now," is a positive statement. And you can each, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this, look out the window and verify whether that is a true or a false statement of fact. So it is objective in that it could go either way. In contrast, normative statements involve value judgments from the person who's making the statement. And conclusions are based on those value judgments. And in general, what makes a normative statement is that it cannot be tested or verified in some sort of scientific method type fashion, right? So normative statements are often opinions or feelings, and those can't be tested and verified scientifically. They're not less valid. Both positive and normative statements have their place in economics, and we need both of them. What becomes important is recognizing the difference between these two types of information and recognizing how we utilize them in developing our own perspectives. So my hope for you as you work through our chapters, as you seek to understand what you think and feel about what we're learning together, is that you will build your own positive and normative statements about economics at the macro level, and that you'll do that through some reliable data selection and some evaluation. And I want to close with a little extra slide here that is not in your chapter, but what you can use to help you understand your sources, what makes them good, relevant, and useful. Think about the acronym DARK. We will be looking at sources primarily with documented methods for where the information came from, or that are clearly identified as opinion or personal feeling. We're going to be looking for information that's as accurate and complete as we can possibly get. We're going to stay focused and relevant to the problems and questions that we have presented to us in each chapter. We're going to use information that is as recent and timely as possible. Sometimes the best information is today years old. Sometimes the information can maybe even go back a few years, but we'll balance that out. And we'll always try to use credible publications and individual sources that we value and trust. And as we go forward, I will always commit to giving credit where credit is due and citing my sources, and hope that you will do the same. And so that's going to wrap up our review. Remember to go through each of the review questions after you've read the chapter. Make sure you understand each of the items, that you feel confident, or that you can hit me up with any questions. We also have a little positive normative statement review here so that you can preliminarily work through some sources and be able to identify what is more likely to be a testable statement of fact. We can verify it, or we can refute it and say, no, that isn't accurate, or it's an opinion piece that is really reflecting somebody's personal feelings and perspective, but in a non-testable way. And that brings us to the end. So everyone, thank you for watching. Please communicate if you have any questions, reach out, have some conversation with one another, and I'll see you the next time. Take care. Bye-bye.